Shit is easy peasy, pumpkin peasy, pumpkin pie, mother.
What the fuck?
Hello everyone and welcome back to Vanity Project. I'm Tomas and today we're going to be discussing the top 15 albums that have shaped my music taste. Essentially what we're going to be talking about today is some of the albums that have shaped generally the music that I listen to up to this day even, and the type of music I've discovered as a result of a lot of these albums. These are in no particular order. I'm going to try to kind of order it in the ones that still kind of influence me today, but it's not really going to be in a top 15 format. It's just the 15 albums that have shaped my music taste. Without further ado, let's just jump into it. Kicking off our list, we have the album by Green Day, 21st Century Breakdown. And this album, honestly, is very interesting to me because it's not even necessarily Green Day's best work as a whole. Far from it. Green Day has done quite a lot that's better than this. But the interesting thing about this album, especially the story behind how I first discovered it, is that the music in it is pretty darn interesting. So the premise of this album is basically taking the story of American Idiot and applying a lot of the musical cliches that were very popular and big at the time that this album came out, from the time period between 2010 and 2000. And essentially it's very interesting how I discovered this. A friend of mine who's a very big Green Day fan introduced this album to me around my sophomore year of high school, and since then I've been in love with it. Now, this album doesn't come without its fair share of flaws. For instance, songs like 21 Guns honestly are very bland and kind of seem like inferior versions of Wake Me Up When September Ends. And as a result of that, it kind of isn't very interesting or very creative to me. You know, songs like Know Your Enemy are kind of they have the same chords repeating over and over again, and it's honestly very bland. And also, if you listen to this entire album after already listening to Green Day's previous work, you're probably not going to enjoy it as much as I still do to this day. However, there are quite a few very interesting songs on this album. For instance, American Eulogy is a fantastic song that has all kinds of shakeups and mix-ups all over the place. It changes pace quite a bit and keeps itself being fresh. Songs like Static Age I honestly find very interesting in terms of instrumentation. It's not entirely that complex, but the lyrical content to me has kept me engaged throughout the entire thing. And the two Viva la Gloria, those two songs are very interesting and tell a very enjoyable narrative behind it. Overall, I enjoy this album. It's not necessarily the best album by any means, and I don't come back to it nowadays as much as I used to, but as a whole, it's still very engaging and a lot of fun. Alright, so next, let's move on to our next album. Next album we have on our list is Transmissions by Starset. And my God, this is an amazing band and an extremely epic album. One thing about me from the majority of the bands I listen to is that I've come to really enjoy concept records, you know, a lot of albums that contain a story or narrative or sort of thematic theme. That is very redundant to say, but regardless, some sort of overarching theme throughout the album. And Transmissions is honestly the thing that solidified that into my core. The sound of that album is very operatic, bombastic, and huge, giving you very little room to breathe from song to song. And there, of course, are very small interludes at the end of every single song that sort of leads into the next one. Overall, this album is absolutely incredible. The only real gripe I have from it is the main title song, My Demons. It's not necessarily a bad song by any means, it just kind of detracts from the overall style and theme that this album has. This sort of album takes on the idea of space rock, if I were to call it that way. And it's a very unique form of hard rock, meets a lot of instrumentation that sounds very, very intriguing. The soundscape of this album is incredible. Now, I wouldn't exactly say this album is for everyone, because lyrically, it might not be as complex as what some people, especially of the emo crowd or the alternative genre, would be looking for. But overall, this is an album that I thoroughly enjoyed beginning to end. I love the orchestral elements of it. I love all of the techno boops and bops that they put in the backgrounds of a lot of it, and a lot of the synthesizers. And gosh, I love the vocals on this album. Really, really cool. So overall, I would highly recommend it, and this album still sticks with me to this day.
Nobody rules these streets at night but me, the atomic bomb.
Coming up next, we have Van Halen 1, or just Van Halen if you were to call it that way. And this album, in all honesty, is an absolutely killer debut from that band. Van Halen's a band that I've always kind of heard a lot of their big hits for the longest time, but only until very recently when I started hanging out with a very good friend of mine, let's just call him Jeff, that's really into guitar and classic rock music. I've honestly gotten a lot more into this group, and this album is a very big reason why. This album is an absolute smash hit in my opinion. From the brilliant cover of You've Really Got Me Now, all the way to Jamie's Crying, to the absolutely incredible Atomic Punk. David Lee Roth does an absolutely incredible job on the vocals in this album. He brings forth a completely new thing to the hard rock genre that hadn't really been done before him, except for maybe Led Zeppelin, that kind of brought forth that type of style that David Lee Roth really brought to the forefront. His very high wails, almost screams in this album are absolutely incredible. And of course, the incredible guitar work, of course, done by the absolutely fantastic Eddie Van Halen, absolutely blows me away. In terms of rock music and just an expert guitarist, pretty much him and Jimi Hendrix have pretty much been the ones that have sold me on what you can really do with the guitar and where you can really go with it. Absolutely incredible solos on this album, excellent work instrumentally, from the drumming to the bass work, which really serves to just kind of back the song and give it the real backbone it needs, to the incredible guitar work, to the killer vocals. This album is a must listen to. Even if you're not a fan of rock music, I would highly, highly recommend it to absolutely anyone. It's a blast beginning to end. Coming up next on the list, we have Are You Experienced from, of course, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, which is honestly an album that I wish I'd still be as into as I was back when I discovered it. There's a lot of other Hendrix songs that I thoroughly enjoy, such as Voodoo Child and All Along the Watchtower, but for whatever reason, I don't really come back to this album as much as I do a lot of the other albums on this list. Van Halen 1, I always enjoy going back to it, but for whatever reason, this one's sort of gone into the back of my mind, which is a real shame because this actually is a very, very fun album. From classic songs like Purple Haze to Foxy Lady, to even hits that most people don't even know that much about, such as Manic Depression, which is a personal favorite of mine, and also big hits like Hey Joe, things like that. This album has a lot to unpack, and Hendrix absolutely kills it on a lot of this. Essentially, Are You Experienced is a really fun experience. Hendrix does an amazing job with a lot of the instrumentation, and the rest of the band does a great job backing him up on that. Honestly, in terms of the greatest guitar legends of our day, it's hard to beat Hendrix at this point. The funny thing about him is, in terms of a lot of the pedals and a lot of the distortion that he adds to his electric guitar, I haven't heard a lot quite like the ones that he did. Now, of course, I know kind of how he does it thanks to a good friend of mine who's told me a lot of information about it, how he would basically always keep his amps on and crank them up to the maximum volume and use all kinds of crazy pedals. But anyways, that's besides the point. The thing is that there's very few other bands. In fact, I don't even think I've heard another band at all that's quite encapsulated the same kind of sound that Hendrix achieved on his own guitars. And that's something I always got to commend him for. So, Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced? Brilliant album. Enough said.
You make me feel like I've been locked out of heaven for too long, for too long.
Coming up next on our list is Unorthodox Jukebox by Bruno Mars. An absolutely fantastic kind of funk album that honestly, I continue to go back to a lot of those tracks to this day. From the extremely funky and fun sounds of Locked Out of Heaven, and even Treasure, which is an absolutely fantastic song to dance to. I absolutely love jamming to that one. To the kind of reggae kind of sound of Show Me, this album is honestly an absolute blast. Gorillaz is another bombastic, enjoyable song that's pretty wild as the song entails. Honestly, the album as a whole is an absolute blast to listen to. A lot of fun, danceable tracks, really great bass line, especially in Locked Out of Heaven, and Treasure is just a treasure. That's all about I can say for this album. It's not necessarily an album as a whole that I come back to, but tracks like Locked Out of Heaven, Treasure, and Show Me, I'm always going to go back to those. Moving on to honestly one of my favorite bands of pretty much all time, and absolute legends among the rock and roll world, we have Queen's Sheer Heart Attack, an album that I absolutely enjoy beginning to end, from killer tracks like Flick of the Wrist to the opening sound of Brixton Rock, all the way to classic songs like Now I'm Here. Pretty much everything about this album is a sheer treat. In the Laps of the Gods, it really shows the kind of operatic sound that they're really going to go for further, especially in songs like Bohemian Rhapsody. In fact, this entire album, honestly, is a brilliant precursor to what they eventually will do in the future. Songs like Flick of the Wrist with all the backing vocals and stuff like that, to the opening track of the album, to In the Laps of the Gods, pretty much every song on this album is sheer rock and roll fun, and I can't get enough of it.
Hello, goodbye, it was nice to know you. How I find myself without you, that I'll never know.
Next up on our list is an album that I've listened to very recently, that from a band that I'm not even sure a lot of people are really aware of. But that would be 2 Cent Show from Steam Powered Giraffes. Now, if I wanted to talk about a song that has influenced me, I would have to go from the album Quintessential. But in terms of albums that have really influenced my music taste, 2 Cent Show's gotta be it. From the songs Honeybee to Steamboat Shenanigans, well wait, I think that was actually from their first album. To Suspender Man, this album is an absolute killer from beginning to end. It was very hard for me to choose between this album and their very first album, considering the fact that both have had a very big influence on me musically. But like I said earlier, bands have a very theatrical flair to it, especially very vaudevillian bands, which I'll get to the reason I'm into those in a second, absolutely get me hooked. And Steam Powered Giraffe, their big concept is the fact that they are singing robots, essentially. As a whole, if it hadn't been for this album, I honestly would not be as into this band as I am now. Now, if I'm gonna be more honest, the album that probably influenced me even more than this was a live album titled Steam Powered Giraffes Live at the Walter Robotics Expo, which, honestly, a lot of the songs in that live performance, I honestly could argue are even better than the ones from this album itself. It's a blast. I'd recommend listening to quite a bit of Steam Powered Giraffes' discography. They really do have a lot of talent, and they're not really just a steampunk act. They have songs of all different kinds of varieties, and it's really, really fun stuff, so definitely check them out. Next up is an album that I didn't even realize I'd heard a few songs from before. And in fact, whenever I first rediscovered it, I was very hesitant to actually pick it back up. But once I finally did, I found that I actually really loved it. The entire idea of it, that is something that not a whole lot of artists do nowadays, is combining a lot of rock elements with hip-hop and R&B types of styles to it. Travie McCoy is a phenomenal rapper and also a very creative and talented person, and the entire band helps him out with this. Now, the album I'm talking about, of course, is the one that should be right here if I've edited this video right, and that album would be The Paper Cut Chronicles 2. Now, overall, I've grown to really fall in love with the rest of their discography, especially The Paper Cut Chronicles #1 and The Quilt. Honestly, the two albums that I enjoyed the most from them, due to the instrumentation and a lot of the styles of rapping that Travie actually does in those. But this album is the album that first introduced me to them, and a lot of the electric guitar work, from the way that they have a lot of the pedals and distortion to it, sounds really cool to me. I don't know why, but there's certain sounds in terms of guitars that absolutely drive me insane, and this album definitely has helped really refine that kind of sound that I look for when it comes to electric guitar work on rock albums. All the way from the beats to the creative songs like Holy Horse Man, which tackles the concept of religion and how some people take it a little too far and actually don't practice what the actual religion preaches. Seriously, this album is absolutely incredible, from the opening track Material Girl to the closing track that is very much a sequel to, not really the closing track of Paper Cut Chronicles 1, but it's a sequel to Kid Nothing from the first album, and the final one for this one honestly goes right from where the final instrumental ends off there, just at a slower tempo, and goes into the full song in an incredible way, really. And just the screaming from Travie in that song, oh my gosh. There's also killer tracks like Lazarus the Giant, which is absolutely incredible, from I've Been Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. You know, it's an absolutely fun kind of ride going through the entire love story of this guy as he's traveling the country. There's also Solo Disket, which is basically a song about a guy fantasizing about dancing with a girl, but he's actually dancing by himself, and kind of the loneliness that comes behind that. Honestly, this album I still enjoy to this day. And of course, there's the song that everybody knows about, which has a guest appearance from Adam Levine, Stereo Hearts, which is a very good song. Honestly, after listening to this entire album, it doesn't quite engage me as much as the rest of this, but overall it's still a song that I enjoy. Basically, Paper Cut Chronicles 2, solid album. It's honestly aged fairly well in my opinion, which is something that I can't quite say about their first 2 or 3 records. Overall, Paper Cut Chronicles 2, highly recommended, really enjoyable album.
Is there anyone out there? 'Cause it's getting harder and harder to breathe. Is there anyone out there? 'Cause it's getting harder and harder to breathe.
Next album on our list, we have Songs About Jane by Maroon 5, a band that I've had an interesting relationship with. I've enjoyed a great deal of their work up until their most recent album, which really bored me, which really disappointed me, because I've always quite enjoyed pretty much everything Maroon 5 has done, even V or 5, depending on what you call it, because it's a Roman numeral for 5. I don't know what it's supposed to be called. What do you think I am, a miracle worker? Maroon 5 has been a band that I've honestly quite enjoyed for a very long time. And this album, believe it or not, I had already heard a great deal of the songs before. Back when I was in 6th grade, honestly, a lot of my friends were into Maroon 5. And a lot of the songs off this album I had heard way back when. So when I rediscovered this album, having never listened to the full thing, and I started off from the title track, Harder to Breathe, I got all these memories coming back into my head of just, oh my gosh, I forget how much I loved this album. It's absolutely a fun ride from beginning to end. To really funky and really fun songs like Shiver, to really incredible songs like Not Coming Home, or the pop rock sound of Through With You and This Love, or even just the pure hard rock and roll sound of Harder to Breathe. This album is an absolute blast, and I could go on and on about all the songs I love in here, such as The Sun, Sunday Morning, all kinds of incredible songs here, in all honesty, all tackling variations of the same theme. The only complaint I'd really have about this album is that the closing song for it is a little bit on the slower side than I would have thought would be appropriate for this album, considering the fact that it is such a fun ride from beginning to end. I could go on all day about talking about each individual song, but I'd have to set a day aside to probably review that. So, let's move on to our next album. Moving on to the next album that have really influenced my music taste, we have Soul Punk. Yet another very funk-centered, kind of glam rock type of album. And honestly, Patrick Stump did an incredible job with this thing. I can honestly say this album stands up even better than a lot of the newer, or even some of the old Fall Out Boy records in my opinion. There's absolutely killer hits on this album, like Everybody Loves Somebody, or even To Run Dry, which is a full-on non-stop funk little song that leads into a glam rock kind of style near the end. It's an absolute blast. A big theme that I noticed in this album is a great deal of things like vices and some virtues as well, which is ironic because there's a Panic at the Disco album with the same title that doesn't handle the subject nearly as well as here. The album starts with the explosive hit that of course is appropriately titled Explode, which tells the story of a great deal of different people dealing with a lot of things in their lives that are slowly pounding down on them until it feels like they're about to just explode from all the commotion. There's a song like This City, which honestly is not quite my favorite, but lyrically is a very strong song talking about maybe not necessarily Patrick Stump's city, but just cities in general, about all the crazy stuff that makes a city, all the characteristics both positive and negative, but still leads to being the place that you love being. There are even all kinds of songs that tackle a wide array of subjects, from infidelity to flat-out greed to loneliness to all kinds of things like that. Especially the song Ally, which tackles an amazing glam rock sound and is an absolute killer through and through. I absolutely enjoy that song beginning to end and can't really get enough of it. It basically talks about a girl that essentially was so good way back when in the relationship, but essentially things fell off and Patrick, or just the protagonist of the song, wonders if it would be so good if he ever saw her again, if they could ever rekindle that kind of connection they had back then. The only problems I really have with this album are the two kind of closing tracks. The first one being Coast With Me, which the instrumentation of being the very 8-bit kind of sound I honestly don't enjoy all that much. It kind of is really grating and annoyed me, and lyrically it was honestly very bland compared to what the rest of the album had to offer. And the closing track itself is just a new version of This City, except with a rap bridge in the middle, which honestly does not extend at all. But this album has very much shaped the way that I look at music, especially my love for a lot of funk and kind of dancey tunes. If you're looking for a fun album that has all kinds of funk bass lines and all kinds of grooving songs that you can easily move your feet to, this is the album for you.